Okay, so welcome to the 2021 UC Davis Docent Training. This lecture is with Dr. Charles Goldman, and Dr. Goldman is a distinguished professor emeritus at UC Davis who has devoted his career to studying the effects of environmental pollutants on lake ecology. He developed the first UC Davis course on oceanography and limnology and taught at UC Davis for 52 years with 1,500 undergraduate students, more than 100 graduate students, and 37 postdocs. He served as an advisor to presidents, governors, senators, and countless other leaders about the environmental health of Lake Tahoe. He founded the Tahoe Research Group at UC Davis, which is now known as the Tahoe Environmental Research Center. He has worked on every continent on the globe, from Oregon's Crater Lake to Antarctica, where a glacier was named after him. His long-term Lake Tahoe ecosystem study on the early stages of eutrophication, or the excessive richness of nutrients, made it possible for governmental regulatory agencies to utilize science-based decision-making for the conservation of Lake Tahoe, as well as other threatened lakes. Dr. Goldman has received many honors, including the Nevada Medal, the American Society of Limnology and Oceanography, or ASLO, Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Einstein World Prize in Science for his enduring efforts to understand and protect Lake Tahoe and for his tireless advocacy for limnological research, training, and stewardship worldwide. And I am going to turn it over to Dr. Goldman. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will spotlight you, and then I will be able to start your presentation when you're ready.
Thank you, Heather. Real pleasure to be here and to have heard Jeff's excellent presentation, particularly on the mysis and phytoplankton and small particle interaction. I'd like to begin by commenting that at no time, probably since the advent of the atomic bomb, has humanity been so threatened. And of course, that's by climate change and global warming. Heather, I'm hoping you can control the slides. Can you? There we go.
You're muted, Heather.
Yeah.
Let me say that again. Thank you. So we are up. This is the outline for Dr. Goldman's presentation, and we have a lot of photos and some questions for Dr. Goldman that we would like to ask him. And so I'll just go ahead and get started. Can you see that, Dr. Goldman?
Right, the study of biological, oh, right. What is limnology? Actually, it's kind of the embarrassment in a way of our profession that almost nobody's heard of limnology. And the reason is it's a Greek root, limnos, which means lake or marsh. And there's a Greek island called Limnos in the Greek islands. It's really, we'd like to claim it's the best of ecology because it gives an equal emphasis on the biology, chemistry, and physics of waters. We claim everything from the shoreline inland to salt lakes. There are even limnologists that studied tree hole communities, the little water accumulated in tree holes. And of course, a lot of work done on salt lakes. So it's a fairly extensive group of aquatic scientists now. And if you want to tell people quickly what a limnologist is, you say, well, that's an inland oceanography, or inland oceanographer, because of course, everybody, thanks to Sea Hunt and so on, knows quite a bit about the oceans. I started teaching soon after my arrival to get the job at Davis, I had to agree to teach a course I'd never taken, human anatomy. And of course, limbs and human anatomy was quite a confusion when you were asked, just what do you study, Dr. Goldman? And you say, well, legs, which can sound like legs in a crowded room. It causes some confusion in the early days of my time at Tahoe. These are a few shots of the good days, the better days, and of course where I am now over here in the lower right-hand corner, an aging, but still fairly active old guy. Next. We've done some books, a limnology textbook that was adapted by many of the limnology courses globally for quite a few years. Did a second edition with my co-author, Alex Horn, and it then became an international student edition. I like to look back over the fun days. This is I did my doctoral thesis in Brooks Lake, Alaska. This is Dick Painter, my assistant during that period, employed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I did a pretty scary dive with what was supposed to be a dry suit in Brooks Lake, Alaska, which leaked very badly. And thanks to the heftiness of Richard Painter, he was able to pull me out. I was pretty blue at the time. And that was, lower left was from Russia. This was in Colorado, Horsetooth Reservoir. And this was during the advent of the Tahoe Baikal Institute in an attempt to get some conservation-minded studies into Russia. We created over 20 years ago the Tahoe Baikal Institute, and we brought 10 to 15 Russian students over to join the same number of American students, put them to work in the Tahoe Basin. Here we are cleaning Polaris Creek, which drains into the Star Harbor harbor, getting the rainbow trout back into that stream, able to spawn by removing the silt from the bottom. I used to do a lot of high dives off the cliffs of Kickapoo Park in near Urbana, Illinois, and near Denver, or near another small town near Champaign, Urbana. And when I was introduced as a speaker in Japan to the biggest audience I've ever had, there must have been 1,200 in that one, I was challenged to dive off the top of a 650-ton research boat, the Verschagen, with the captain. He challenged me to this dive, and we both went off the bridge of this. And I swear I was at terminal velocity when I hit the water. We made 10 trips to Baikal over the years, and our Tahoe Baikal Institute was fairly effective in actually training lots of Russian students in environment, and actually helping them with environmental projects at Lake Baikal, which I'm sure many of you know is the oldest, deepest lake in the world. It's 3 times as deep as Tahoe. It's a kilometer deep, and control. Actually, you could pour all the Great Lakes into it just to fill it up. Enormous volume. I like to remind people that Tahoe, enormous volume, enough to cover the state of Texas to a depth of about 8 inches. Lake Baikal would cover the Texas in map view to 98 feet. So it gives you an idea of the enormous volume. All the Great Lakes could be poured into Lake Baikal and just to fill it up.
Great. Well,
Right.
this
Oh,
was one of the questions that we had for you, which was, can you tell us when you first visited Tahoe and what was your initial impression?
well, I came west when I was offered the job as an instructor, step one. That I think is uh, maybe a little bit above a graduate student, but not really very much. I had all my possessions, my children packed into an old Chevrolet, and with my Grumman Grumman canoe on top, full with all the portable possessions at the time. And when we got to 89, I thought, well, I ought to look at this lake, and just incredibly impressed by Tahoe's beauty. And I realized at the time that Tahoe was going to be threatened with the same things that were the eutrophication of eastern lakes, or lakes east of the Mississippi, which were in great decline. So I got to Davis that year, and with an old wooden boat, began studying Tahoe the same year, and ever since up to my retirement in 2010. Quick research history, which Jeff has covered nicely in terms of John Fremont seeing Tahoe from a mountaintop. John LeConte, who was the first acting president of the University of California, was in communication with the first limnologist, the world's first limnologist, which was Professor Farrell from Switzerland, who had learned about the Secchi disk from Farrell, and used his wife's dinner plate to make the first transparency measurements in Lake Tahoe in 1887. He published this in a journal, the Orland Monthly, which dealt mainly with Indian affairs, gold miners, highwaymen, and the like, but also occasionally covered a little science. G. Evelyn Hutchinson, at the time, probably the world's leading ecologist at Yale, visited Tahoe to study fish introductions for the California Department of Fish and Game early in the century. And in 1958, we began work out of UC Davis, coming up with an old wooden boat and a 3-horsepower outboard to make the first transparency measurements post LeConte on the lake. The Tahoe Research Group was then started with 3 graduate students I had. The first Tahoe Secchi and 14 studies were begun, and Turk, the Tahoe Environmental Research Center, of course, has been carrying on this work under the careful direction of Professor Schlotto. What was this?
Yeah, I can ask the question. What was the status of lake water quality in the early days, and how did it progress over time through your observations and the work of the UC Davis Tahoe Research Group?
Well, I had, of course, worked in Alaska, and a wonderful duplicate of Tahoe in terms of water quality was Lake Basharoff, which was crystal clear and was a very important return and contributor to the Bristol Bay sockeye salmon fishery. The fish came up the Agagek River into Basharov and spawned in the multiple tributaries of the lake. Having come from the University of Michigan, I had encountered the early stages of eutrophication in quite a variety of eastern lakes. And of course, the big problem was noted in Lake Erie, where one of the tributaries actually caught fire from pollution, and oxygen levels were being depleted so dramatically that benthic organism growth was declining everywhere. Some cyanobacteria, we used to call them blue-green algae before they were recognized really as bacteria, are highly toxic and produce a neurotoxin, sort of like the red tide that prevents us from consuming certain shellfish, particularly oysters, along our own west coast. The problem, too, is that climate change was increasing the threat, particularly of the harmful cyanobacteria, which benefit from warmer water conditions and have the ability to float above their competition, the more desirable phytoplankton, shading them out. And so they're really the big harassment, and I have a handful of them there at actually at a small artificial pond in Davis. My main research work, which I was able to transfer directly from Alaskan studies, was determining what nutrients were actually limiting algal growth. I had developed at Michigan a new and highly sensitive technique of measuring growth response within minutes, actually, utilizing radioactive carbon, which was taken up along with the regular carbon and could give you an indication immediately of what nutrients were in short supply simply by providing a series of nutrients to cultures. My first work actually in Alaska was using pickle jars, since we didn't have a lot of gear in those days. We immediately noted that primary production was increasing steadily over the years, particularly in the response to nitrogen. Nitrogen and phosphorus tend to be the main limiting factors, although later on at Castle Lake, I made my most important discovery of molybdenum as a trace element, actually limiting algal growth and limiting fish production, since it's very tied closely to the availability of nitrogen, largely in the form of nitrate, which has to be reduced by the plant to use it. So there's an enzyme called nitrate reductase, which requires molybdenum. And Castle Lake was very short of molybdenum. And by making a experimental salt shaker application, actually about 5 pounds of sodium molybdate for a 50-acre lake, we were able to increase all levels of the food chain, including the trout production, which was quite exciting at the time, and resulted in the use of aerial applications of trace elements in some of the Canadian lakes. But over the years, Tahoe was increasing in algal growth at the same time that transparency was declining. And probably the most important science to application occurred when the Fleischmann Foundation awarded $100,000 in the early 60s to Engineering Science, a small engineering firm. And I got my first small consulting job since I was a limnologist already working on the lake. And there was great concern about what to do with the sewage being produced by the steadily increasing population. As it turns out, if you add tiny amounts of sewage to even treated effluent, of course, to Lake Tahoe's water, you turn it green. At the same time, and important in this discussion, is the fact that tertiary treatment, which can produce a drinking water quality effluent, was being utilized extensively throughout the United States. Energy was cheap, and tertiary treatment conversion of plants had become, of sewage plants had become quite popular. As a result, tertiary treatment equipment was added to the South Tahoe plant, and there was a plan to treat the sewage after it was collected and discharge it into Tahoe following tertiary treatment. At the time, engineering, a elite group of, there were civil engineers in those days. They're now called environmental engineers, two from Berkeley, McGahee and Pearson, and Kaufman from Stanford, Hassler and Rolich from the University of Wisconsin, to manage the decision on what to do with sewage at Lake Tahoe. They asked me about it, and I took tertiary treated added it to mid-Lake Tahoe water in a culture and turned it green within 3 days. They weren't really certain about this young instructor from Davis, so they imported carbon from the Swiss water establishment, who confirmed my studies, and as a result, the export of sewage of Lake Tahoe was undertaken over to Indian Creek Reservoir at the south end of the lake, where the water is utilized for irrigation purposes. You get fertilization, of course, with the irrigation, so it's very valuable on that side of the basin. And of course, out on the north end of the basin, Martis Valley Treatment Plant, ground seepage to the river, which is pretty well solved the problem, because we had septic tank treatment with almost every house, I guess, in the basin at the time. And this nitrogen loaded groundwater seeping into the lake, contributing to the fertilization and the increasing loss of transparency of about a foot per year, as Jeff had mentioned, and increase in algal growth, which was about 5% per year. This is an example of two perfectly parallel lakes in the Canadian example, where a famous, now unfortunately deceased limnologist, David Schindler, added nitrogen and phosphorus to the on the left, and the lake in the background, which was the control, of course, stayed nice and clear. Evidence of the eutrophicating potential of nitrogen and phosphorus. Algae on the shorelines washing up became really the first visible indication to a largely shorebound population that Tahoe was changing. We had other indications of the changing Tahoe environment. when I first got to Tahoe, the stones on the bottom of the lake were all nice and clean. Within the first 5 years, they began to develop an attached algal component called periphyton, which made the rocky shoreline quite slippery. Pope Marsh, in 1940, this aerial on the right, the largest wetland in the entire Sierra Nevada. They were able to get a permit to build a Venice development there known as the Tahoe Keys, which I think almost everyone is aware of. And in 1967, it looked like this. They hadn't completed the build out, but you can see how the difference in water quality within the basin. And then by 20 years later, the build out had been fairly almost completed by 1987, representing the death of major wetland. This picture and a variety of other ones was very helpful in my meeting with Ronald Reagan later on in this discussion, when we convinced him that the federal government needed to be involved in sorting out the problems with 5 counties and 2 states and various municipalities dealing with the gradual decline in water quality. Road works tend to be very eroding areas, since they're often, in those days, were hastily put in with no erosion protection provided as are now required. Air pollution was neglected for a long time. When we finally began to monitor the air pollution to the lake, we discovered that it was a major source of particularly nitrogen. And when you consider the millions of vehicle miles around the lake in the summertime with the NOx by vehicle exhaust, this is not really too surprising. Dr. Schlotto mentioned the importance of very small particles in declining transparency. And if any of you have seen a large truck pass on the roads in Tahoe, you'll often see this swirl of fine dust just to the side of the road from the airflow created by the passing truck. These very fine particles stay in suspension for hours. And as evening progresses in the basin, cooler air slides down the mountainsides, carrying these particles out over the lake where they're deposited, contributing particularly phosphorus. We've got other kinds of shoreline pollution, particularly plastics, which are threatening the health of the oceans and are probably also a serious threat to Tahoe's long-term future. Trails and so on tend to erode. This is a trail that Heather Sigali photographed, where water collects and develops a temporary stream basin and carries particles onto the lake, where a group called the pipe people, I guess, been getting data for some time on discharge of sediment. The Secchi disk has been nicely covered by Dr. Schlotto, and we depended heavily upon the very good eyesight of Robert Richards to make those measurements year after year. And the League to Save Lake Tahoe became very important in publicizing the science. We're at have been at a very low ebb in recognition of the importance of science during the somewhat confusing COVID period. But in the early days, I think without the League to Save Lake Tahoe's publications of our scientific results, particularly on the changing transparency, it was very fortunate that they came up with the slogan, Keep Tahoe Blue, and people did understand the clarity of water, and the Secchi disc was simple enough for everybody to understand that we were losing clarity at a rate. Dr. Slato carefully covered the thermal characteristics and the resistance to mixing that occurs as a lake warms. I think it's really important to recognize that these indications here of, I don't know, can they see my arrow? I guess not.
No.
But what happens when the lake mixes to the bottom is that you bring nutrients up from the bottom. So during these mixing events, when the lake mixed all the way to the bottom or very near the bottom, we were followed always by a immediate decline in transparency. These low transparency years were always years where deep mixing following a deep mixing event. So nutrient input from the deep waters, which accumulate, of course, through the decomposition of materials falling, promote the enormous interannual variation that we have in transparency, which correlates very nicely with algal growth rate. Next. Again, returning to the biological aspects of the lake, the historic food web involved lahont and cutthroat trout, tule chubs, mountain whitefish, the same zooplankters that were present prior to the mysis introduction, and some near shore bottom fish. There were sculpins, which actually in the early days of my fishing off Cave Rock were a great bait for trout. I did want to add one thing to Jeff's coverage of the mysis and fish populations. The mysis were introduced really with the idea that they would provide food for the kokanee salmon. Unfortunately, because kokanee salmon are sight feeders and don't come in contact with the mysis during the daytime, their size decreased appreciably with the disappearance of the Daphnia. And at the same time, the lake trout average sizes carefully covered over those years by Mickey Daniels, the I would say #1 guide on Tahoe up until his death. A wonderful man, kept wonderful records and tagged many lake trout, which were, of course, deprived of a lot of their sockeye salmon prey and decreased in size at the same time. Let's go on to, like most of the world's lakes, there have been lots of intentional and sometimes unintentional additions of what we call exotic species. This shows the timeline of rainbow trout being added, then the lake trout, the California crayfish, Passifasticus lineisculus, kokanee salmon, then the mysis introduction, the demise of the Daphnia population, and we have, of course, the introduction of Eurasian milfoil, the Asian clam, and a variety of warm water fish, including goldfish. People would bring their goldfish up to Tahoe for the summer, and instead of taking them home, would dump them into the Tahoe Keys, along with sometimes smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, bullheads, and carp. So we had a lot of introductions. The plankton food web looked like this, with mysis, of course, destroying the Daphnia. Bob Richards senior authored a paper entitled "Where Have All the Daphnia Gone?" After the mysis introduction and the demise of Daphnia and a close relative of Bosmina. And that brought us to Jeff's idea of removing mysis relicta to clear up the water. Crayfish in Tahoe, we had a population of approaching 60 million adults at any one time in the lake. They serve an important service, cleaning up the bottom. I once did a night dive with the Davis divers, and came along with my light. We were actually censusing crayfish, and I found a whole line of them lined up on the San Francisco Chronicle. And I thought, my gosh, they were just lined up perfectly. They can't be reading that editorial. But when I looked more closely, I discovered they were consuming the newspaper. So they do a pretty good job in Tahoe. And we shipped 56,000 crayfish to Tahoe, thanks to the, I guess, billionaire at the time, Hans Rausing, who developed the Tetra Pak milk cart. He paid for the collection and transport of those, which were a free gift to Sweden. We thought it was just like sending the wine grapevines back to France using our rootstock. And now the main crayfish in Europe is the California crayfish, which turned out to have several advantages over the native crayfish, which was killed off of a plague of North American origin, which got into Italy and swept through Northern Europe very rapidly, absolutely decimating the populations of Asticus asticus, their native crayfish. And if you don't have crayfish in August, it's like not having turkey for us in Thanksgiving, aquavit and crayfish. Here's a goldfish taken from the Tahoe Keys by Turk staff. They're invasive, and they're gradually moving with the warming water around the lake. Next. Climate change. We've been concerned about that ever since we began doing solar recordings in Tahoe back in the well, at the end of the 50s, early 60s. And we first had a decline in solar radiation and a actual decline in the temperature of Lake Tahoe. In fact, at one time I predicted if the trend continued, Tahoe would actually freeze, because the whole water column very closely approached the maximum density of water, about 4.5 degrees. And had it gotten any colder, the cold water would have stayed on the top, and Tahoe might have formed a ice cover. But things changed very rapidly with climate change. And as the lake began to warm, things began to increase the periphyton growth around the borders. We had some appearance of blue-green algae, which we worry about a lot. And I became more and more involved internationally with the climate change. This book, which is an edited version, covered 25 different environments from the high Arctic all the way to and including the Antarctic, published by Wiley Blackwell, London, about 4 years ago. Next. I wanted to emphasize the importance of Bob Richards, who was a student, undergraduate student. He took my first oceanography and limnology courses at Davis, then went off with the U.S. submarine fleet, actually snuck into a Russian port, Vladivostok, one night, and had a look at it, and then returned to do graduate work at Davis. He overwintered with his wife and dog, Micah, at Castle Lake, doing winter lake collections in a variety of lakes, castles up by Mount Shasta in that vicinity. And his master's thesis was a winter study of these lakes. So I consider him a real hero of research and data collection at Lake Tahoe. He still lives on the West Shore. And I think without his dedication to sampling Lake Tahoe, we would not have one of the very best long-term data sets in existence in North America, if not the world. Our boats, the San Giuseppe was a Monterey 1942 vintage trawler that we converted to the second research boat. Our first one sunk under mysterious circumstances from rime ice. And then the John LeConte seems to have been sabotaged. It sank during a period when I was very unpopular with the first regulations going in. Judge Garcia actually made a ruling of a 2-year moratorium on development, which of course greatly upset the developers. There was a strong tendency to think in those days, this was in the 60s and 70s, that the lake was there at a time to charm, or not charm, but to tame, along with the forests and the Western environment. We go back to that boat. That's the fourth Tahoe research boat named for Robert C. Richards, the best and longest term data collector, probably of subalpine lakes anywhere in the world. We worked out of the old fish hatchery at near Tahoe City, 1.6 miles to the east, where John Steinbeck wrote his first book. Good question, what was the name of that book? It was not well received. It was called Cup of Gold. This is inside a building that we built within the building, since the hatchery, of course, was not insulated in any way, and began the long-term data analysis, water chemistry that we were able to do there. Thanks to Heather Segali, who received a grant to finish the inside of the building once it was renovated. We have a second establishment near Tahoe City, which serves to treat samples that need to be treated immediately when they're brought ashore, store the massive oceanographic style equipment that Dr. Schlotto has been
I just want to check that your microphone isn't covered. We heard some noises.
oh,
There we go.
there, I guess I put my hand over it. So I was asked what the general attitude concerning the future of the lake was. And these were possibly even dangerous times for me. I used to get threatening phone calls, and this joke on the right, all I can figure is that he must have inspected the water quality of Lake Tahoe when he became entangled in concrete. But of course, there was a bit of the mafia on the North Shore in those days. But this prevailing coverage, which I pretty well mentioned already, that build, gradual recognition of the danger of unbridled development, public awareness, largely through the League to Save Lake Tahoe, federal Judge Garcia's very unpopular but very important moratorium on building based on science. Creation of a federal Tahoe Regional Planning Agency, the TRPA, which was subject to a lot of abuse in the early days of its existence, and then court challenges. Another thing that was really important at Tahoe was that when William Kelly Cody developed a very nice development at Upaway on the eastern shore of the lake, or southeastern shore of the lake, he wanted to extend the development up the erodible slopes behind the development. And at a time when nitrogen was becoming saturated in the lake, and the lake was becoming increasingly phosphorus sensitive, this would have been a disaster in terms of water quality. So this was tried in Minden, Nevada. I was the expert witness for the states of California and Nevada. There were several of us. And the fact that the judge understood the limnology of the lake and the switch from a nutrient limiting factor dominated by nitrogen to an increasingly phosphorus sensitive lake, we won the case. It was a $14.5 million lawsuit against both states by William Kelly Cody, the grandson of Wild Bill Cody himself. Multiple town hall meetings were occurring where this Western idea of it's here to conquer prevailed, but gradually they became aware that if the water quality of Tahoe declined, everybody loses. And we must credit the League to Save Lake Tahoe with getting that message across. And this message, I think, is being further presented by the science of the Turk activities and the efforts of you docents. That is amazing. I had an interview with Ronald Reagan and Governor Paul Laxalt, along with League to Save Lake Tahoe representation, creating the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. Dianne Feinstein became a strong advocate for protecting the lake, as did actually Senator Harry Reid. And it was Harry Reid and actually John Garamendi who made it possible to get Bill Clinton, then President of the United States, together with come on, don't drop a name now. Everybody knows this guy, Al Gore. And this is a plankton net that Bob lowered into the lake. He's looking at the plankton. And I guess it'll never happen again. We were in rifle range of shore, another amusing event. Bob Richards' wife, Kit Richards, is a superb baker, and she made a heap of chocolate chip cookies, which were in an open can just to the right of the door going into the John LeConte. As Clinton and Gore came aboard, the Secret Service, which were packed in the cabin, had provided bagels and coffee, but they looked to the left and they looked to the right and they just pounced on those untested chocolate chip cookies. And of course, we were in easy rifle range of shore, going out and coming back in. That sort of event probably will never happen again. So it was quite exciting. I and Bob Richards were classified as non-protectees. If we came under fire from shore, Clinton was supposed to rush to the bow, hop on the porta potty, and be covered with a bulletproof blanket that they brought aboard. Obviously, that didn't happen, but it was a quite interesting event. And it happened at a time when there was no competing news of importance. So people saw this in airports all over the world on television, and it created a great deal of international interest to Tahoe and our efforts at the time to protect the water quality. As you look back, you asked the questions.
I can ask the question for you, Dr. Goldman. As you look back over your career at UC Davis, what do you feel was your greatest contribution?
Well, it's hard to pick the greatest, but certainly physically convincing those civil engineers that they couldn't put tertiary treated water into Lake Tahoe was among the very most important. Otherwise, we'd have a very, very green lake, which I demonstrated to them with that bioassay. Then winning this extremely important lawsuit, the William Kelly Cody case, or William Cody Kelly, if I'm right, case was very important because that would have opened up enormous land destruction had he won that case. And of course, having the John LeConte, we got the John LeConte research boat when I couldn't get a building permit for land we had on the west shore to build a building. Won't go into that in depth, but we had a then followed by a town hall meeting where we were prevented from building in the backyard at Bristlecone, where we would have provided some office space for park department. And we lost that site, but we were fortunate in being able to build on an improved site and village on the lower campus of Sierra Nevada College. And it took 4 years and raising $14.25 million from the private sector. And this is probably the thing that will last for a while in terms of what are legacies. But certainly the most important legacy are the 101 graduate students, 37 postdocs, and the undergraduates that learned about lake protection and are scattered all over the world now that keep up the legacy. These are good memories. I still hear from lots of my students, and they are globally dispersed, which is having impacts well beyond the shores of Lake Tahoe. In fact, there's a general misconception that we have solved the problems at Lake Tahoe among the world viewers of the Tahoe situation. It's a work in progress, and Turk has picked up the mantle from the Tahoe Research Group in fabulous fashion and shows great promise for continuing the fight to protect the water quality of this lake.
So this is an opportunity for anyone to ask questions. And I know already that one of the questions was, why is Crater Lake not considered an alpine lake?
Because it's a volcanic cone lake. It's was created by volcanism. It has no watershed, and I haven't had a recent measurement from Crater Lake. It was a little bit more transparent than Lake Tahoe, and also a little deeper. But it has, since it's in a volcanic cone, it has almost zero watershed, just this slopes down from the, and no input streams. So it's quite different. Tahoe is a graben fault lake formed by either the movement of the floor down or the mountains up on its side. And it's a classic graben lake.
Another question that just popped in was that pollen is an important part of the Tahoe ecosystem. Is that true? And can you tell us about the pollen or elaborate on the impact of pollen?
I can remember one summer when the wind of Tahoe was actually green. A chartreuse wind blew across and of course just inundated everything. Pollen, which is used in reconstructing the history of environments globally, is tremendously resistant to decay. And most of it just settles out on the bottom of the lake and remains there. And we can actually reconstruct the history of the lake on the basis of or the vegetation around the lake, as we've done with Castle Lake, by palynology, actually studying the pollen. And it's annoying because, of course, it coats surfaces, forms a film on top of the, where it floats on the water surface. But I don't think it has much biological impact in terms of being an effective fertilizer. It's just so incredibly resistant to decay that lasts in the sediments for thousands of years.
Great. Another question was, what do you think the impact of the temperature change on the lake's layers, or like the stratification? How would that how would we expect that impact to have a impact on the mysis shrimp or the mysis ecosystem, the plankton ecosystems?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and it made me think of another possibility for removing the mysids from Tahoe besides trawling them out. What happens during years of non-mixing, the oxygen levels in the deep water begin to fall. And if we hit a point where there isn't sufficient energy and we only get deep mixing during late winter storms, that Tahoe does not mix to the bottom anymore, we will begin to lose the oxygen in the bottom, and the lake trout, not the lake trout, the mysids will not be able to descend to the bottom of the lake as they do every night. Consider they go all the way down to the bottom and back to the surface as the light, they're negatively phototropic. In other words, they avoid light. So if we lose the oxygen in Tahoe, there are going to be a lot of changes. For one thing, when a severe storm might interrupt this deoxified layer in the anoxic layer is a proper term in the bottom of the lake, it'll bring not only poor oxygen water to the surface, which can kill actually aquatic organisms, but it'll also bring a lot more nutrients out of the bottom of the lake. Iron, for instance, is held in an oxidized form in the sediment, and as the sediments become anoxic, phosphorus is given back to the overlying waters as the redox potential changes.
So there have been a couple questions about the Tahoe Keys, and one was just I think you covered it mostly, but the impact of the Tahoe Keys. But then more recently, could you talk about the possible use of herbicides in the Tahoe Keys? And someone said that she thought you called that area the Pope Marsh. So Pope Marsh was the name of where the Tahoe Keys was built. And that was one of the largest wetlands in the Sierras, or was it the largest?
It was the largest, and I have differed from some of the agency attitudes on use of a herbicide. Long ago, I suggested putting a plastic dam across the Tahoe Keys and using a herbicide that would decompose. This was, 20 years ago when I started advocating this response. But the regulations, particularly with Lahontan, were so severe on non-use of herbicides or pesticides, I guess, in the basin, were such that I've never found much support. I think now that Eurasian milfoil and exotic warm water fish are beginning to spread around the lake. I actually saw a small school of bluegills this summer in Star Harbor, and largemouth bass are encountered in most of the harbors now in Tahoe. And Eurasian milfoil is becoming an increasing invasive species of plant that's causing a problem. But I still think it would be a good idea to take a herbicide that has a proven decomposition rate and at least apply it to one of the arms of the Tahoe Keys to check out its advocacy. I still think it's the only way we're ever going to get the higher aquatic plants under control in the Tahoe Basin. And we could probably at the same time get rid of the warm water fish in the Tahoe Keys.
Great. Question about using UV light to fight the invasive plant species.
I've also followed that with interest. I think the problem with UV light is that it takes an awful lot of power to produce enough UV light to effectively kill plants. I know there's a study going on in the Keys now that may provide a better idea of whether it's practically possible. It tends to kill off the vegetation, but not the roots. So you might have to do repeated runs of UV to actually obtain a sustainable operation there. So personally, I would like to see a lot more data before a huge effort is put into UV eradication of the vegetation in the Keys.
Great. So I think this is a great one to close with. There is a graduate student who had to take a break for family, who is a student under Dr. Chandra. So she called herself a grand student, and wanted to say thank you so much for letting us see how your career developed and all these amazing insights on Lake Tahoe. And she is fortunate enough to have met you at Castle Lake, and so she is a grand student. So
I hope to come back. I hope to come back to your area of study, Dr. Goldman. It's an honor for me to be here with you.
Oh, we can't hear you. I think that your microphone's blocked again.
Oh,
there you go.
One of my students that I really like to brag about is Carol Folt, who worked on the chemical warfare between zooplankton in Lake Tahoe. She is now the president of the University of Southern California, the first limnologist to become a president of a university since Burge at Wisconsin 100 years ago. So I'm really happy about that. Is there any way I can whip through those last pictures? We have
Yes,
time for those.
sure. Let me get back to
I
those.
love this memory lane that Heather has presented. And I'm working on a book in Adventures in Limnology. This was in 1956 in Brooks Lake, Alaska. Brooks Lake drains out over the Brooks Falls. This was when I like to think I looked like a Navy SEAL as a limnologist at Brooks Lake. And the next one is that fateful dive. This is before I went into the water. When I came up, this dry suit, which you can see has O-rings at the wrists and the neck, leaked. And I was not only waterlogged, but nearly frozen and almost as blue as the suit when I came back up. In the Antarctic, it was mentioned I have a glacier named for me, which according to my students is not receding yet. And I made the first beer in the Antarctic. That's why I have a real interest in the Alibi Brewery. Great beer, and they've been very kind donating beer to occasional Turk events. This is Lake Vanda. Those are two of my students, John Priskew at Montana, and that's on the other side is Warwick Vincent, the youngest member of the Canadian Academy of Sciences, just recently elected, who teaches limnology in Canada now. And this is me attempting to communicate with a seal on the Ross Sea in the Antarctic in 1960 or 61. Not sure which year. This is taking ice cores to get down to the water in Lake Vanda. This is a solar pond. It heats up the bottom water of the lake, which is maintained by a high salt layer, to 25 degrees. So it's overlain with cold water, but this salt stable layer at the bottom collects enough solar energy every year to get a little bit warmer. The idea of solar ponds, I think, has been adapted for energy management in Israel. Oh, this is looks like a CIA expedition, but it was in Lapland, Sweden, where we were able to work through the ice on the 4th of July. That's just me. And that's in Russia on Lake Baikal. I love this lane. Well, and I was captured by the Argentine River Guard and spent 10 years incommunicado at their Ferrari River base, Paraná River base in Argentina, where I made great friends, dug them a swimming pool, roasted a lamb for them, and had a really great time while they were trying to decide what to do with me. This is with Jack Valentine, another deceased limnologist, at Lake Baikal at the International Limnological Congress. When to hold up the honor of North America, we plunged into this frigid lake, along with, of course, the Scandinavians who didn't think we'd do it. After running up and down the beach, holding a bottle of Glenfiddich that provided enough courage to jump into the water and out very quickly. Oh, and here we are undercover at another World International Congress of Limnology in Israel. We just muddied ourselves up in the Dead Sea. I somehow was selected to carry the Olympic torch out of Squaw Valley during the Winter Olympics that were in Utah, and that was great fun. Unfortunately, the person that I was passed the baton to wasn't there, so I had to run not a quarter of a mile, but half a mile to pick up the next carrier. And at that altitude, that torch, a butane torch, got very heavy.
And there it is.
Thanks for letting me go through those slides.
Yes, thank you for taking the time. Thank you to everyone, and we will see you all at the Tahoe Science Center. And yeah, thank you very much.
It's
We'll
hard to quit, Heather, but I wanted to thank all of the docents doing an incredibly important job. It's just can't thank you all enough for sticking with the really important public education of the Tahoe visitors. Nothing is more important for the future of saving Lake Tahoe. And I want to thank each and every one of you for doing it.